What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. Chapter 7 in the series, Intrasexual Mating Competition. Reviewing this paper, Intrasexual Mating Competition by Crims, Bradshaw, and Mary, I think it's said, from the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships, Chapter 7. Let's go on now to the first slide. So we're looking at intrasexual competition. What is it? What does that mean? So, same-sex competition. So it's intrasexual, right? Intersexual, the opposite sex, intrasexual, same-sex competition. Members of the same sex, they compete for mates and sexual access, an observation made by Charles Darwin way back in the day. We also see competition for non-sexual, non-romantic outcomes, status, right? But that can also be an indirect competition or directly for mates. So the two are kind of linked there, but sex within or competition within the same sex. Important points about this going forward that I want you to keep in mind throughout this video. Members of the same sex, they compete to get mates and to retain mates, okay? And the nature of competition, we mentioned this I think in some past videos in this series, reflect the features that are attractive to the opposite sex, right? Or features that the opposite sex finds desirable. So men and women compete differently, and they compete to kind of win over other members of the same sex on traits, features, behaviors, signs, signals that the opposite sex finds desirable. So, for example, if bravery is something that's highly desired to women, a desirable trait, then men might compete with each other to show off who's the bravest of them all, right? Who is the brave guy? And so they're competing to show off, to signal to women, I'm the bravest, I'm the bravest. Why? Because women value bravery in men. As an example, many such things, but that's one example. So this also means that intrasexual competition may look different for men and women, right? Men and women value different things in an opposite sex partner. Sometimes they value the same things. Sometimes they value different things, okay? So sometimes we're gonna see different competition for different things, right? Both men and women compete. Initially, if you go back to Darwin, it was kind of thought and observed like, men compete, women select. But now we know both men and women compete, okay? So let's go on now to the next slide. Some evolutionary meta-theories, right? So this is kind of the background to understanding this. Obligate parental investment. Who is obligated to invest in their offspring and who invests in offspring more, right? Parental investment theory. Trivers, we've talked about this, I think, in most of these videos in this series because a lot of this evolutionary psychology goes back to these very influential meta-theories about evolutionary behavior, right? Not just human behavior, but also animal behavior. Well replicated, well observed. So the sex that invests more in offspring is going to be pickier, right? That's going to be the choosy sex, the more selective sex. Meanwhile, the sex that invests more, the sex that invests less, ignore the more in the slide, is going to compete more to be chosen, right? So the sex that invests more selective, the sex that invests less, competing more to be chosen by the selective sex. This also means that sexual access is limited by the more selective or the discriminating sex. So women are kind of the gateway to sexual access in that case. This also means, or related to this, I should say, there's a reproductive ceiling for women or for females across animal species, right? That a woman can only bear and carry one child at the same time. If it's an animal that has litters, many, and I guess, in human beings as well. It's not necessarily just one, but you're limited, right? 9 months of gestation, that kind of a thing. For men, not necessarily the case, right? A man could conceivably impregnate one woman and then another woman and then the next woman in the span of a week. How often does that happen? Not very frequently unless you're like Andrew Huberman, right? So reproductive ceiling for females. Meanwhile, this also means there's higher reproductive variance for males. Some men can have very high reproductive success, many mates, and you're going to see this much more in animals than in human beings where it's kind of flat. In some animals, a male can monopolize all of the females and completely exclude other males. So you have one male that has very high reproductive success, a bunch of other males that have very low or zero reproductive success, and that is higher reproductive variance for males, okay? So females invest more, and you see this kind of at every level, right? From the gamete size, the sperm and the egg, pregnancy, carrying the offspring to term, lactation, producing physical resources for the offspring, caring for it as it gets older, etc., etc. In species where males invest more, we see this flip. We see the associations are reversed there, okay? Then we see males are more selective, females compete more, so good evidence there for this association with obligatory parental investment and selectiveness. Trivers, parental investment theory. Males, similarly, or I should say conversely, or whatever the case may be, compete more. More physical aggression, male-male physical aggression, more sexual rivalry. You see this in like murders, right? Many murders and homicides over sexual rivalry. That's a big cause of it. Males take more risks in their competition. Men also might engage in more kind of cultural construction or productive behavior to signal high status to acquire resources, more showing off, etc., etc. So more competition there. Next slide, let's go forward. Now, does the parental investment theory of Trivers mean that women compete less? As I mentioned, that's kind of the early observation in animals and that sort of thing. Women were viewed as low competition, not just human women, but females across species, viewed as low competition and even kind of just passive selectors of males. Men would compete with one another, or males of non-human animal species would compete, and then females would just select the winner. So the belief that females and women and humans don't compete at all, it's not really held now. We know that men and women both compete, okay? Early observations, maybe they relied a little too much on just physical aggression, just seeing very overt competition in animals, that sort of a thing. Like we can see the males competing, right? We can't see the females competing, so they're not doing anything. Female competition, as we'll see throughout this video, it's more covert, right? So it's there, maybe it's not as easily observable or detectable without, a good examination, a close examination. But women can compete, they can do it quite vigorously and aggressively with each other, but it can look very different, right? We'll get into that. So, another meta theory, we talked about this in the first video, sexual strategies theory, David Buss. This explains female-female competition in perspective a little better. Let's go on now to the next slide. Looking at that. So, sexual strategies theory, intrasexual competition. This includes Trivers' observations from parental investment theory and the greater male variance hypothesis, right? Or reproduction, greater male variance in reproduction, I should say, Bateman. And this also kind of adds the observation of long and short-term mating in human beings, right? Context defines competition. It's not just as simple as competitive males and picky females, as you might, kind of thought in earlier days or with parental investment theory, that sort of thing. So we have short-term and long-term mating here. Short-term mating in general benefits men more potential offspring, as we explained in a previous slide. And so we see that reflected in male behavior, male psychology. Men have a higher desire for more sexual variety, for short-term sex, that kind of a thing. And men compete more with one another for short-term sexual opportunity. So, something to consider here as well, a lot of animals, because they do not form long-term pair bonds, right? Human beings, as we mentioned in a previous video, are one of about 7 to 9% of mammals that form these really long-term monogamous pair bonds. A lot of animals just don't do that. So a lot of non-human animal sexual behavior is all essentially short-term mating. And so that's probably where we see these observations of like high contest competition and that sort of a thing. Competition within males for short-term mating, which is the only mating essentially that you see in a lot of non-human animal species, okay? Long-term mating, on the other hand, has similar benefits, right? There's kind of less asymmetry here for men and women. So we might expect competition to be similar in men and women for long-term mating access, right? We might see many things that do line up. So we see some sex differences. We also see some similarities between the two sexes. And as we mentioned in, the first video on sexual strategies theory, when should we expect similarities and when should we expect differences? We expect similarities when the reproductive challenges are the same for men and women. We predict differences when the reproductive challenges and burdens and what they're facing is a little bit different, okay? So an example here, men and women, they both show very high levels of jealousy in long-term relationships. So here we see jealousy, intrasexual competition, right? Mate guarding, that kind of a thing, that evolved to maintain long-term relationships. Men and women, there's a little bit of a sex difference in jealousy about what they get jealous about, sexual versus emotional, that kind of a thing. But both are still very high for men and women. Men and women both have very high levels of jealousy, of possessiveness, of mate guarding, that kind of a thing. So let's go on now to the next slide. Competition can be understood through the context of a market, right? A mating market, a biological market. We can choose partners, and partner quality varies, right? Not all partners are of the same quality. We choose them. This also means that good partners can be kind of limited, right? Within the market, there's only so many good potential mates. So we kind of compete for the best mate, as they say in here, or, in parentheses, at least the good enough mate, right? We do kind of a satisficing selection. We want good mates. We want, potentially the best mate. We don't necessarily maximize, like we have to have the best. Everyone is just kind of going for the extreme best. But we do compete for good mates, right? So there's supply and demand here. There's only so many good mates. There's high demand for those mates. The extent to which there's demand and supply depends on the environment, right? So there's these socioecological factors that impact mate selection. How many good mates are there? How much competition is there? And one of the things that leads to a lot of competition is sex ratio, right? How many men are in the mating pool? How many women are in the mating pool, right? If you have, 3 men for every 1 woman, then competition among those men is going to be much more fierce than if you have like a 1-1 ratio, right? If you have a lot of women, they might behave differently competing with one another than they would if you had a lot of men, right? And women had more to select for. So this is something that's observed across animal species, again, that sex ratios change mating behavior, mating strategies. We mentioned this in a past video, right? What happens when there's a sex ratio, when there's many women and fewer men? Then those women become more open to short-term encounters, and the men engage in more short-term encounters. They invest less. They show less signs of desire or commitment for a long-term relationship. And when it's reversed, when there's fewer women and a lot of men, then those women can be more demanding kind of for their interest, right? Which tends to be long-term relationships. So in men, more aggressive, right? Men become more aggressive when there is a sex ratio, when there are more men, right? When there's an unfavorable sex ratio, right? 3 men to 1 woman, or whatever the case may be. And men spend more on mating-related costs, that kind of thing. They buy more expensive engagement rings. They spend more on Valentine's Day presents, are some examples given in this chapter. In women, what do we see? When there are many women and few men, women show more suspicion of same-sex others. They try to exclude them more. And also women begin to seek more career opportunities, right? As they put in this chapter, later in the chapter, women kind of choose, in some cases, the briefcase over the baby in that sense. So they kind of drop out of competing, which they talk about, that should probably be explored a lot more, that women, instead of perhaps seeking mates for status and provisioning and that kind of a thing, are going into careers. They're saying, okay, I need to kind of fulfill these historically male roles. Anyway, next slide here. Mating systems and intersexual competition. In mammals, polygyny, the most common mating system. In human beings, as we mentioned in past videos, it's actually monogamy. They don't talk about that in the chapter, but in past chapters they did. So polygyny, the most common mating system in mammals, tends to be what we see, where a competent male will monopolize groups of females, right, and shut out other males. And this is not necessarily polygyny. Often you'll think of like polygamy, social polygamy, forming harems or forming long-term relationships with multiple mates. In the case of, many animals which do not form long-term relationships, it's simply monopolizing female for reproductive success, that sort of thing. And so this produces very high reproductive variance for males, doesn't it? In human cultures that have polygyny, we see similar effects. Competition is increased for the men, right? There's going to be, more men that are single, that are excluded from mating, even with a 1-to-1 sex ratio. Why? Because some men are taking 2 or more women out of the mating pool. There's not enough women to go around in that case. So we tend to study monogamous cultures more, just generally across relationship science, evolutionary psychology, that kind of a thing. We tend to study Western cultures because we live in Western cultures. Those are the samples that we have in hand. We haven't necessarily studied kind of intersexual competition in polygynous societies quite as much, but there is some good research on this. We know about certain things like this. One that they mention in this chapter is that in polygynous cultures where there are co-wives and that kind of thing, we tend to see these form hierarchies, right? First wife, second wife, that kind of a thing. There's a hierarchy of wives. Some wives have status over other wives. They have power over other wives. And this competition can become quite fierce. That first wives can even drive subsequent wives away, that kind of a thing. So we see competition within women in these situations as well, right? So we see male-male competition. Men are competing with each other to acquire multiple brides, and at the same time, we see women competing with each other in these relationships for that single man, right? Who's going to be the first wife? Who's going to get most of his attention? Whose child is going to get most of his resources? Who's going to, whatever the case may be, who's going to get more attention from that guy? Anyway, going on now to the next slide. Income inequality competition, okay? We know that competition for income and competition for mates are associated. They talk about this in the chapter. Some people have hypothesized this could even just basically be the same thing. Why do we even care? Competing for income? Perhaps it's just a form of competition for mates itself, right? That mating fundamentally is kind of what's there in the back of your subconscious, or whatever the case may be, driving that. So this also means that income inequality might influence intersexual competition even more than absolute income or poverty, which seems to be what we see. For example, poverty is not necessarily the best predictor of homicide, male-male homicide. Income inequality, on the other hand, is. So it's not necessarily like everyone is living in poverty, but we see a lot of competition between men when there is a more stratified hierarchy, when there's some big haves and some big have-nots, okay? So when only a few men are affluent, then men compete more to be affluent, and women also compete more for access to those more affluent males, kind of like we described in the previous slide. When there is polygyny, men compete to acquire multiple wives, and women within those relationships kind of compete for that individual's attention, okay? So more income inequality, as I mentioned, leads to more male-male homicide. According to this chapter, it's a good predictor of that. And why is that? Why are these male-male homicides occurring? Well, we know a lot of these homicides occur over perceived slights, right? They're just kind of like someone's in a bar, they get in a fight, there's perceived slights. So these are little status struggles, right, that lead to murders within men, just insults that just spiral, that kind of thing. Those are actually a really big cause of homicides. Another one is attempts to gain resources. That's actually not as common, I think, leading to homicides, but that's something that you see, right? So exercising violence over another person can be a way to attain status within your social group, status or dominance over that individual that the violence is being expressed upon, to gain resources, such as in a crime for money, like a robbery or something like that. And then also conflict over mates, right? Men kill each other over women, right? So someone's cheating, or, you know, someone took someone's girl, or whatever the case may be. That also leads to murders. For women, on the other hand, what do we see in situations like this, where there's kind of this competition associated with inequality and all of that? Some of the research they noted in this chapter, women engage in more self-beautification, so makeup and all of that. In cultures like this with higher income equality, we also see that more women post selfies online. So women are kind of displaying themselves to attract mates, right? Social media, intersexual competition manifesting in the modern environment. So polygyny and inequality, what sort of things might we see there? Women also might decide it's better to be the second wife in a polygynous society of a high status man than it is to be the monogamous wife of a lower status man. That's kind of a decision or debate that women individually have to make in these cultures. Not mentioned in this chapter, but some good papers on polygyny and all of that. We also know across polygynous societies, women still show an overwhelming preference for monogamy. But then if you have high income inequality, then there's kind of that choice to make, like, okay, monogamy with a low status man, or polygyny, becoming the second wife of a high status man. So next slide. Dimensions of competition. So dimensions, what are we talking about? Men and women, what are they competing over? Competing over what? Well, men and women are competing with the same sex, and they're trying to embody the traits that the opposite sex desires, as we mentioned at the very, very beginning. Something to keep in mind. Men and women compete for mates, and the dimensions of what they compete over are those things that are desirable to the opposite sex. So the highest priorities for both sexes, something shared by both sexes here, kindness and intelligence, very well replicated across the evolutionary literature. I think a lot of people will say, I don't believe that. Kindness and intelligence, how important is it? Well, I mean, think about the way men and women behave with each other on a first date. If you doubt it, are they being mean to each other? Are they trying to signal that they're stupid? Probably not. They're probably trying to signal like, hey, we're getting along, we're vibing, I have charisma, and I'm having a good time, and I'm kind of clever, right? No one is just deliberately trying to signal like I'm mean and I'm stupid, okay? So there's few sex differences there, but where do we see sex differences? It's where male and female mating preferences, evolved preferences, diverge. So we know men are more attracted to cues of fertility, right? Cues of fertility, as we mentioned in previous videos in this series, are perhaps the evolutionary rationale for why we find certain things attractive, okay? Like youth in women, for example, or why men value physical attractiveness more, because physical attractiveness in women is associated with higher fertility, right? Or something like waist to hip ratio. Why are certain forms of makeup used to enhance certain features? Because enhancing those features, you know, making your skin smoother with cover up or foundation, associated with youth and fertility, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that men are attracted to these cues of fertility, and therefore women engage in enhancement techniques that kind of enhance those, right? And Women, on the other hand, attracted to signs of protection, provision, that kind of a thing. So we know that men compete over things like resources and status, and signs of that indirectly. So it could be something like muscularity or whatever the case may be. Anyway, going on, next slide. Men's preferences and women's competition, as we said, men's preferences dictate what women compete over. So as we said, evolved preferences of men, youth, fertility. So women enhance traits to reflect these, wearing makeup, corsets, waist to hip ratio, that kind of a thing. Many examples of this in the previous video. Also, parental uncertainty, right? We know, if a woman is pregnant, she knows the baby is his. If a man is pregnant, he does not necessarily know. So there's a high evolutionary risk, a risk to genetic fitness in that sense of raising offspring that is not belonging to that man. So, that's one explanation for sex differences and jealousy. Why men show more sexual jealousy than women. Not to say that women don't also show high sexual jealousy. Important to remember that in case you think that means women don't care. They obviously do. But parental uncertainty, because there's kind of that evolved preference for that, women also display signs of fidelity, chastity, that sort of thing as attractive to men. They try to signal that to men. Now, intrasexual competition determines the things that individuals try to enhance to be attractive to others, right? To outcompete rivals, but it also determines the kind of behaviors individuals engage in to denigrate rivals, to take them down, to insult them, right? What's the evolution of insults? Why do we insult each other? It's intrasexual competition. Insults are intrasexual competition. Why do we insult people in certain ways, right? Why do men use different insults against men than women use against women? What sort of things do we insult about the other person? Men might call each other weak. Why do men call each other weak? Or men might say you're a pussy or whatever this thing. So, saying someone is weak or saying they're feminine or whatever. Why? Because women like strong men. Women like masculine men. That kind of a thing. Why do men insult each other by calling each other gay? Because it's implying like this is not a viable mate for you as a heterosexual woman. What do women say? Well, we know that women slut shame each other a lot, perhaps more than men do, across some of the research like that of Joyce Benison, for example. So what is going on when a woman is saying that? They're saying low parental certainty here, right? They're saying men value fidelity. So how do we make this woman look less desirable to men? By denigrating their reputation, right? That sort of a thing. And that's kind of what we see with female intersexual competition and insults. They use the kinds of insults that would make other women seem less desirable as mates, to take their reputation down, that kind of a thing. Next slide. Women's preferences. So what do women prefer? Men's competition. What do men compete over that women prefer? Evolved preferences for women, right? As we said, Trivers, all of that, women invest more in offspring, higher obligatory investment. So men compete over resources that signal provisioning ability or investment. Women select for cues of provisioning ability that don't necessarily reflect actual provisioning ability. So something we see across the literature as well is a lot of what is desirable to women is not just like he has a lot of money, but it's like he has the ability to provision, to provide, to protect, that sort of a thing. So these are cues of provisioning ability that would have been valuable in ancestral environments, but they're not always linked to those things today. So physical size, muscularity, height, these would indicate, okay, he can protect, he can provide, he's a good hunter, he can bring resources in, and also traits that are symbols of provisioning ability today in a modern environment. So level of education is something that women select for, level of income is one, and cues of status like job titles, right? That don't always even match up with actual income. So think about high status job titles. They're not always the most lucrative job, right? So no one's gonna say like computer programmer, sexy, even though they make a lot of money. Status jobs though, like doctor, yeah, right? Fireman, that kind of a thing. So men display resources, they physically compete with each other, and they express kind of jealousy of good rivals, right? Rivals who embody the traits that they want to have. Rivals who have traits that they want to have, they're competing with those rivals. If they're presented with a rival like that in their environment, jealousy goes up, right? So that's kind of how we know, like, yeah, these are important things. Anyway, next slide. Sex differences in intrasexual mating tactics kind of going on here. Men and women compete on different things, as we said. So the tactics that men and women use in competition, they look a little bit different, okay? Men engage in contest competitions, not so much in the modern environment, but at least not physically violent contest competitions, but certainly in the ancestral past, that seems to be the case. These are zero-sum games with one winner, right? So a sports game would be a coalitional example of a contest competition, but also individually, like a game of chess. Someone wins, someone loses. These tend to be overt competitions. You can clearly see it's a competition, it's structured to be a competition. If it's spontaneous, like a physical fight, or if it's ritualized, like a sport. Direct physical competitions, often in many cases. Sometimes kind of harnessed or indirect competitions that are still very overt. So homicide, for example, risk-taking, who can do the better trick on the half pipe or whatever the case may be. Who's going to show off to women more? Like we mentioned in one of the past videos, what did we see? Men tried to do more tricks and show off more when a woman was recording them skateboarding than when a man was recording them skateboarding. So kind of an example there. In the Yanomamo, the famous research of Chagnon, tribe in Brazil, very violent, what do we see there? Men who have killed more other men have more wives. Okay, and so the physiology of men also reflects this kind of ancestral past of contest competition. Size, right? Stronger bone structure in the skull, that kind of a thing. Much greater upper body strength. All of this reflects, men probably had to fight with each other and be strong in some sense. Women, on the other hand, they're more likely to use what's called scramble competition, which is kind of the covert seeking of resources that are widely dispersed in an environment. So this is kind of a solitary acquisition of resources or competition, and it's also a covert acquisition of resources or competition in that case. So what do we see? How does this manifest in female intersexual competition? A lot of use of social exclusion, although men and women both do this. We see this a little bit more in women, that women are more likely to try and, as we mentioned, ruin the reputations of other women, exclude them socially from groups, that kind of a thing. Women attack reputations, so this is harder to see. Gossip, things that go on kind of behind the back. This is not necessarily an overt competition. And what does that do? Why more covert competition? Because it reduces the risk of retaliation, which can be more damaging, and particularly even physically damaging, for the sex that has a more fragile physical constitution. So, different outcomes for men and women, 4 different types of competition, right? So there's different costs and benefits for men and women. So physical competition, women just don't take a punch as well as men do, so there's higher costs to getting into a fist fight for women. Women can be more damaged if they get into, a fist fight. Imagine a woman who's pregnant having to get into a physical competition. Oh, now she lost the baby. That kind of a thing. So physical competition, riskier for women. They don't get as many benefits from it. So different consequences of competition, different types of competition, different cost benefits, that kind of a thing. Next slide. A little bit more here on covert competition and social exclusion, that kind of thing. So, as we said, men engage in more overt competition, but men and women also both use covert competition and exclusion. So, covert competition, beneficial for both men and women. You can kind of imagine why. It avoids costly retaliation, right? If you can compete covertly and your rival doesn't know, then they can't retaliate, they can't respond to it, that kind of a thing. What do we know about women? They tend to work to separate potential rivals. And I didn't mention this chapter, but I wonder if this is avoiding coalition building, because we know that men and women engage in competition not just individually with each other, but also in groups, right? Coalitional competitions. So if we can separate potential rivals from one another, we might be able to stop them from forming a coalition who can go against you, right? And that's something we see in women. Women might do this a little bit more. Observing, research in girls, they exclude same-sex peers more than boys do. It's very common if you look at, young girls, from like 10 up to 18 or 20, they'll have like one best friend. They don't have big groups of friends and like coalitions as often as men do. They're more likely to kind of exclude that and to form like closer bonds with a single female peer. So, coalitional indirect competition or aggression. Male coalitional aggression, as we mentioned kind of just a moment ago, forming groups, male groups that are cooperating to compete against other males individually or in groups. Obviously, a good example of that, war, right? Where one tribe is fighting against the other tribe. One band of men is fighting against another band of men, raiding, that kind of a thing. And for females, we tend to see something similar but covert, right? So coalitional informational warfare. So getting information, spreading it among the group, it's gossip, right? Gossip is kind of how women do it in that sense. Coalitions are probably important here to maintain social exclusion, right? Because if you want to socially exclude a rival, you can socially exclude someone from yourself, but if you want it to be really effective, you kind of need everyone on board with that. So coalitions might be kind of important to socially exclude a rival, okay? In humans, there's less evidence that female and female competition, intersexual competition, actually helps mating success. We'll get into that a little bit more because it's not like there's none at all, but there's more evidence of this in animals, right? Let's go on and kind of look at that a little bit more. So, suppressing rivals can also suppress their reproductive capacity in a biological way, right? We see effects on ovulation, on hormone production, on mating behaviors, libido, that kind of a thing. So they give an example of marmots, for example. Female-female harassment suppresses reproductive ability hormonally, right? I think it was glucosteroids, I'm not sure. I'd have to check the chapter again, but just off the top of my head. So this kind of behavior can diminish reproductive cues that are salient to the opposite sex. So not very well studied in humans yet, but an example of this in humans might be that more popular girls, they tend to enjoy more dating success. They tend to bully rivals more, but more attractive and more popular girls also tend to get bullied a little bit more. So this kind of female indirect aggression, it might be best directed against rivals who are more sexually receptive. Popular girls get bullied more attractive girls kind of get cut down to their own level. In research on bullying, I don't know to what extent they went into that in this chapter, but a lot of research on bullying that indicates that's the case. So ovulating women, more at risk of same-sex aggression in some studies, that when women are ovulating, other women act more competitive towards them. And we know, again, mentioned in one of the past chapters, social stress can disrupt ovulation in women, can disrupt conception, right? So if a woman faces a great deal of social exclusion, she's facing a lot of stress or something like that, maybe she's missing, a fertility window because of that. Maybe she's even losing a child because of that. Indirect social aggression, right? Because this is how women compete, often indirectly, covertly, gossip, behind their backs, social competition, emotional competition, women may have also evolved to be a little bit better at picking up on really subtle social cues and like reading facial emotions. And that's another thing that we see. Women score higher in theory of mind ability, right? Which is like cognitive affective empathy. So empathy is not just like feeling how the other person feels. It's being able to model their mental states, their emotional states, predict how they're going to behave, even read emotions in the face, right? So the reading of that mind in the eyes test, for example, just shows pictures of eyes. Can you accurately tell the emotion that the person is feeling just from the way that their eyes look? Women do this better than men do. So that's kind of an example there. Sex differences in theory of mind could support that. Let's go on now to the next slide. Frequent victims of intersexual competition. Who is at risk here? Who is going to be competed against more and why? So one prediction that we could make here is that men and women who aggress disproportionately against others might be more at risk of aggression themselves. I'm not sure to what extent they talked about this in the chapter, so I put it in brackets here. But this is actually really well supported, I think, as far as all of the research on bullying and bully victims, right? So about half of people who are bullied also engage in bullying themselves as adolescents, that kind of a thing. So there's this big category of bully victims. Who's getting picked on more? People who pick on each other's more, people who are more disruptive, that kind of a thing. So more desirable men and women are at higher risk, right? They're the most threatening rival, whatever makes them more desirable, if it's more physically attractive, more dominant, whatever the case may be, they are the more desirable rival, so they become a target. Like I mentioned in the past slide, more attractive women, they engage in more bullying, but they're also bullied more. So, bully victim category here, kind of overlapping with that, disproportionate aggression kind of overlapping with that. So higher desirability, more at risk of being a target, right? More physically attractive women tend to be the recipients of intersexual competition more. This is supported by the research according to this chapter. More socially dominant men, wealthier men, men of higher status, we might also expect them to be the recipients of intersexual competition as well. I think the research on this is more mixed. As they mentioned in this chapter, it might be a little bit less supported. For example, men who are more physically formidable, who are stronger, taller, that kind of a thing, they do get in more physical fights, but it might actually be because they start those fights more, is what they say here. It's not necessarily that they're just the passive recipient of bullying. They might be the ones that initiate this aggression more. So, women, given the nature of this, that male competition is very overt, female competition is more covert, we might expect as well that women are going to face more difficulty mitigating aggression, right? They can't see it coming the same way that a man does. So, something to consider there. Let's go on now to the next slide. Status competition in men and women. So, competition for status, we've mentioned this throughout the video, it's often explored, researched in the context of men, and it's seen as something that's crucial for male mating success. This is not necessarily the case the same way for women. We don't know, I think the evidence is not quite as good, that female status is competitions lead to greater mating success. We mentioned that, but female status is related to mating success, okay, and reproductive outcomes, that kind of a thing. There's a lot of reasons why, a high status woman, regardless of the marker of status, might do a little bit better. But we do have to ask, what effects does female status have on attracting men or competing with rivals? It's been explored less than status competition in men. Male status competition, we know kind of what effects that it has. So acquisition of resources, attractive. Fends off rivals, which gives you an advantage. Makes the men more attractive just by winning these competitions. If it's a status competition or even contest competition, whatever the case may be. This is not quite so clear for women. Physical cues of status in women don't actually seem, to work the same way that they do in men. So size, for example, taller women are not seen as more attractive than shorter women. There's kind of a sweet spot there. Education and income also, it doesn't seem necessarily to help women either. There's been some research on dating apps that indicates women that list a higher education, higher income, they actually get matched with less. But they mentioned in this paper, that's not necessarily quite so clear either, that there might be an attractiveness and a status interaction. So they describe a study that found, okay, women of average attractiveness, if they're high status, they are perceived as lower desirability. But women who are very attractive, if they also have a high level of education, or they're also high status, then they're even more attractive. So there can be an interaction there where it's like, if you're an attractive woman physically, having high status is really good for you, it helps you. If you're a middle range attractive woman, having high status doesn't seem to help as much, okay? So female status also looks differently, right, than male status does. What gives a woman status? We talk about, resources, education, income in men, but those are not necessarily the things that would produce high status in women. So when we compare status, between men and women, we might not necessarily want to look at, educational level or income level. Female status looks a little bit differently. You can see this kind of in groups of adolescent girls. The pretty girls, the popular girls, so high levels of attractiveness, but then also, more broadly, high parenting ability could signal higher status, right? And also having perhaps a higher possibility of alloparenting or extended family. Who comes from a better family? Whose family is more able to help take care of those children and invest? All of these things that signal, kind of investment in that could be related to higher status in women. Anyway, let's go on next slide. They talk about here at the end some lesser studied groups, and this can also, give you some insights as far as intrasexual competition, how it's kind of reflected across human beings, even in the case, that the groups might actually have different mating preferences. So, talking about gay men, for example, in gay men, we see that gay men show similar age preferences to heterosexual men. And what do we know about age preferences, right? Age preferences, from the evolutionary perspective, they reflect a desire kind of for fertility. Men tend to prefer younger women on average, and the older that men get, kind of the more of an age gap that they desire, right? So there's kind of, this sweet spot of attractiveness for women that's kind of like mid-20s or something like that on average. But we see that gay men have similar preferences, that gay men also prefer younger men. So that, kind of gives rise to a question. It could support perhaps modularity in that case. Are human preferences very specific to the individual interaction, right? Like, would we expect something different for gay men, or are they more modular, that these are the preferences and they're expressed kind of across contexts? If youth and beauty are important to gay men, then we might also expect gay men to compete more over those things than heterosexual men, right? We might expect gay men to compete a little bit more kind of like heterosexual women do in that case, by augmenting youth and beauty and trying to look pretty more than heterosexual men do. So they say some, future work on this that could be looked at as even subtypes within these cultures, right? So like the bear community, the butch, as far as lesbians go, otters, whatever that is. But you have these different communities that have different bodily preferences and that kind of a thing. And so, they might compete more over like who is more of the bear, or who is more of the otter, or who is the butchest, I don't know, something like that. So parents and older adults, also a lesser studied group. But more and more we continue mating late into life. people get divorced, these sorts of things, it's not always the case in human history. We see that more and more now. So this might mean, and they observe this here, that mating can be segregated by parental status. So prospective mates who are parents might compete more with others who are parents. Non-parents might compete more with non-parents. So two mating pools that kind of are segregated. They don't overlap a lot. Single mothers, single dads, and singles without children, men and women both. Single mothers are a group in particular that probably experience more mating pressures. Why is that? We know that, a lot of men are hesitant to date a single mother. Not in this chapter, but from my own research, I did something on dating app deal breakers. What was that? What sort of things would make someone less desirable on a dating app? What would they swipe left on? High for men and women, but even higher for women was being a single mother. So we know that single mothers face difficulty in the mating market. Having children from a past relationship or mate is seen typically as undesirable to the opposite sex, both for women and for men, but even more for women. So that can make the mating market a little bit different for single mothers. This might also make single mothers more careful in mate selection, right? And we see single mothers, they become single mothers and they just don't date anymore. They just they're really cautious in who they want to date. They're very, very selective at that point. Why is that? Because they have a child, so they have someone that they have to protect and invest in, and pay a lot of attention to. We know, for example, that children of single mothers, not mentioned in this chapter, but in other research, I'm just kind of ad-libbing here. Children of single mothers, they're actually at much higher risk from a step parent, okay? So there's potential risks from a new mate to a child. So that could be one thing that makes these women more selective. So you have this kind of combination. Single mothers, a little bit less desirable on average. There's fewer men willing to date them, fewer desirable men in that case, plus they're more selective. So there's kind of this pressure for desirable men and this high competition. So we might expect very high intrasexual competition from single mothers, but this is kind of like lesser studied groups, future directions for research. We don't really know, but I think that's a particularly interesting one. So parents also may act on the mating choices and success of children, right? So parents might engage in intrasexual competition on behalf of their children. Another kind of piece of the puzzle here. Parents of boys, they form different beliefs from parents of girls, for example. Let's go on now to the next slide and look at some of these things. So some more on parents and vicarious competition here. Parents compete on behalf of children to help them secure desirable mates. Not mentioned in there, I think, but a good example of this that came to mind was think of arranged marriages and the negotiations that they go through, these two families to get their kids together. I mean, I'm sure you see some kind of competition there where people are trying to put their best foot forward in all of these negotiations, if you've ever seen arranged marriages and matchmakers and the kinds of things that they go through. So competition like this, it shapes some political and ideological beliefs. So some research has shown, for example, that the parents of daughters, they're more likely to support reproductive rights. So they're thinking of their daughters, their children, who are women, and thinking what could be helpful for them, what would not put them at a disadvantage. Parents of sons, on the other hand, they're more likely to oppose reproductive rights. So they're probably thinking he doesn't have control of these reproductive rights, mating success, that kind of a thing. Mothers with sons, they're also more likely to support practices that suppress female sexuality, research here in some Muslim countries that they mentioned. So they're more likely to support veiling, women wearing the veil in Muslim countries. Why might that be? A mother with a son, what might she be thinking? Not necessarily consciously, but what might be going on here? She wants to make sure that these other women are, whoever her son is essentially hooking up with, mating with, I should say hooking up with, but I'm saying selecting as a long-term mate is going to remain faithful, not be mate poached, that kind of thing, not cheat. What works to do that? Well, the suppression of female sexuality in that case, put a burqa on her, she's much less likely to be stolen by another male. So, second order competition, parents, right? This could be more fierce, and they mentioned this in this chapter. We might expect more of this competition actually from mothers to other mothers than we do between fathers, right? And why might that be? Again, going back to Trivers' parental investment theory, this could again reflect higher investment in offspring. The more selective sex in that case, right? Women, now they're competing more as parents on behalf of their children. In some cases, we might also see parents and children competing with one another. They use an example from Gambia. Older women, younger women in a compound. When there's older women in the compound, they impose mating costs on younger women. They're relatives, so you might see competition there, where it's like, like my older family members are holding me back. They don't go into a lot of details on this, but they're kind of mentioning future directions. So that is it, guys. That is it. That is it. Slides are done. Last slide here. Hope you liked the video. Join the channel. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. Join the Patreon, subscribe, help support the project. I will continue making videos for you. Next one in the series coming up very soon.